Che Guevara. A ruthless revolutionary is intent on destroying the United States.
Che Guevara was a cold-blooded assassin. He had an unbelievable desire of killing people.
In the 60s, he's causing mayhem in Bolivia to spark off revolutions throughout South America that will destabilize the area and threaten American interests. He has to be stopped. So the CIA turns to top agent Felix Rodriguez.
I think it was very personal for Felix. He saw a lot of his friends die.
His mission, capture Che Guevara and bring him back alive. Now, based on recently declassified documents, we can reveal the true story of this secret CIA assignment to hunt down one of the world's most famous revolutionaries. In a remote area of the southern part of Bolivia, a unit of government soldiers are out on a routine patrol. Suddenly, out of the blue, seven are killed. 12 soldiers are taken prisoner. The Bolivian soldiers are losing an ever-widening war against one of the world's most notorious revolutionaries, Che Guevara, who is determined to spread chaos. Che knows the current Vietnam War is tearing the US apart. His aim is to create similar confrontations throughout South America to drag them into it. This, he believes, will allow communism to finally triumph.
He wanted to create 100 Vietnams for the United States so that the United States would be putting out fires. He knew that the American public had no appetite to send troops all over the world. So that was his ultimate goal, bringing down America, which he believed was this imperial threat. He hated America.
In 1961, Che wrote, "The US is the great enemy of mankind. Against those hyenas, there is no option but extermination. We will bring the war to the imperialist enemy's very home, to his places of work and recreation. The imperialist enemy must feel like a hunted animal wherever he moves. Thus, we'll destroy him." Born in Argentina, Che is a professional revolutionary communist.
He was this mysterious figure. I wouldn't say to the extent of Osama bin Laden, because there were differences. But really, the goals were the same, to bring down the United States.
He fights against the US-sponsored coup in Guatemala. He leads the Cuban Revolution with Fidel Castro and overthrows the US-backed government.
If you were going to be a revolutionary, you had to be a hard person. You had to be dedicated. You had to believe in what you were doing, and you truly did.
To students and revolutionary youths the world over, he is a hero, a freedom fighter.
He was young, he was handsome, he was articulate. He had this reputation.
Che believes the United States backs right-wing dictatorships, and those dictators exploit their own people. Only armed resistance, he argues, will address this imbalance.
And that's what made him really popular among the masses, or amongst college kids in the United States, that kind of idealism, that indeed we are an egalitarian society and we're going to level the playing field, so to speak. He's writing how-to books on revolution that are being used by revolutionaries all over the world and being read on college campuses in the United States. He was the picture of revolution.
But to others, Che is a cold-blooded killer.
When we think of Che, we think of him in the beret with the limpid eyes. But the real Che Guevara was a gangster, murderer, killer.
And now in 1967, Che's brought his armed revolution to Bolivia.
The Bolivian government was afraid. They were getting reports from the countryside that there were men speaking a different kind of Spanish, and they had large sums of money, and they were doling it out, and they were trying to buy a huge amount of supplies. They have soldiers out on a routine patrol, and all of a sudden, they're ambushed. And it didn't happen once, it happened several times.
His successes early on terrified the Bolivians because they didn't have the military to combat it.
The Bolivian soldiers are reeling under the attacks from Che's men.
All their equipment was old World War II surplus stuff. They were in desperate need of some modern equipment, but mostly they were in desperate need of some modern training.
Desperate for assistance, the Bolivian president reached out to the US. The CIA, monitoring developments closely, is concerned that if Che's revolution in Bolivia is successful, communism could sweep through huge countries like Brazil and Argentina.
Bolivia borders 5 other South American nations, and from Bolivia, that could be the epicenter of a revolution that would spread from Bolivia all throughout South America and Central America.
If this happens, it will bring communism right into America's backyard. At first, the American response is cautious.
Clearly, they need help. But we didn't want American soldiers going into the field and dying, because we're already engaged in Vietnam, and we did not want that to escalate into South America, into our hemisphere.
Just 17 Green Berets have flown in. Their mission is simply to train the Bolivian soldiers. They are forbidden to fight against Che's guerrillas directly, through fear of inflaming the situation. Che was right. America really didn't want to be sucked into another big conflict.
It was a classic Green Beret mission, which is send, special forces into an area, train the locals, get them really up to speed militarily, train them in the intricacies of war and counterinsurgency, and let them do the fighting.
For the next 4 months, the US instructors, many veterans of Korea and Vietnam, train the Bolivian soldiers.
The men that come to camp are Bolivian conscripts, and most of them had maybe a 4th or 5th grade education. So now you're trying to teach basic concepts to people who don't even have basic math skills.
The military has a term for training. It's crawl, walk, and run. And when the Green Berets got to Bolivia, the Bolivian army was crawling. They did a lot of physical training because a lot of the campesinos didn't have the physical strength that they needed, so they would climb ropes, obstacle courses, and then as they got out of the crawl phase where they were able to use their weapons correctly and patrol correctly, then they got into some walking. They really had to build this Bolivian military from the bottom up in order to be at the level they needed to take on these guerrillas.
They teach them how to march, shoot, move at night, detect booby traps, fight hand to hand, and avoid ambushes.
Building aggression and building them into soldiers was a key part of the training.
So we instilled a very aggressive spirit into them. You got to be tough. You got to, once the shooting starts, don't sit down.
I'm in Bolivia, you were forced to serve. So I think you had to start the training by building that aggression and that fervor to fight the enemy.
The problem facing Washington is not only are the Bolivian army poorly trained, but intelligence on the ground is virtually non-existent.
Our intelligence network at that time wasn't great. We were so focused on the Soviet Union, we had very little intelligence on them. There was so much conflicting information, and that built into the whole myth of Che, this boogeyman. And did he have hundreds of men, thousands of men?
So the CIA calls in one of their top agents, Felix Rodriguez, to lead the hunt for Che. 26-year-old Felix is the perfect man for the job. Born in 1941, Rodriguez was a victim of Castro and Che's revolution in Cuba. He and his family were forced to flee when the communists seized power in 1959.
My uncle, who was a senator in Cuba, so he had to leave the same day to the United States in his boat. And of course, they ransacked his house. And then when I started looking at what was happening in my country, that's really what decided me to do something about it.
Felix left school to fight against Castro. He felt a motivation to go and do this. It was very important to him, and he's been fighting communism ever since.
I think it was very personal for Felix. He saw a lot of his friends die. He saw a lot of their businesses confiscated. He saw a lot of good people hurt.
The young Rodriguez develops a deep loathing for Che Guevara.
Really, he was a cold-blooded assassin. He had an unbelievable desire of killing people. He always hated the United States tremendously.
In 1967, Che wrote an address from his Bolivian jungle camp expressing that hatred. Hate as a factor in the struggle, intransigent hatred for the enemy that takes one beyond the natural limitations of a human being and converts one into an effective, violent, selective, cold killing machine. Our soldiers must be like that. A people without hate cannot triumph over a brutal enemy. Our every action is a battle cry against imperialism and a battle hymn for the people's unity against the great enemy of mankind, the United States of America. Rodriguez is summoned to a meeting with the CIA in his hometown, Miami. He is told that his mission is to gather intelligence on the rebel force and help the Bolivians track Che down. One thing is made very clear to him. His job is to bring Che Guevara back, alive.
Felix was recruited because he had a long history working with the CIA at that point. He had been part of the advance teams that went into the Bay of Pigs, and then he had also worked on some other operations to try to overthrow Castro. So he was well known in the Cuban exile community and was well known by the CIA and had worked for them in the past. And he was a prime candidate mostly because of how eager he was to take part in a mission like this.
For Felix, the thought of going down there and possibly capturing Che, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. It was his chance to give back to the United States and to right what he felt was a wrong to his country.
Rodriguez goes to Washington and moves into a safe house to prepare for the top-secret mission.
It's standard operating procedure for the CIA to use safe houses in Washington. And the reason for that, obviously, was they didn't want people knowing about his mission.
Rodriguez is then given what little intelligence the CIA has on Che. Some personal documents and photographs found in Che's abandoned Bolivian camp, and statements from captured guerrillas and deserters of the rebel force.
It is very important to be able to familiarize yourself with as much as you can with the guerrilla. You want to know exactly how they feel, the way they operate, and that's important when something happens in the field.
As the days go by, Rodriguez slowly builds a picture of the rebel force. He learns that there are approximately 40 to 60 guerrillas operating in a 75-mile-wide corridor, stretching for over 200 miles in a remote wilderness area in southeastern Bolivia. They are well-trained, confident rebel soldiers. Despite the Green Berets' training, the Bolivian soldiers are no match for the guerrillas.
The captured documents that they found were key because they were the first thread that Felix was able to then pull on to try to track the trail.
In the course of his preparation, Rodriguez starts to focus on one particular rebel, a man named Paco.
Paco was a Bolivian who thought he was going to Cuba to study. Instead, his uncle takes him to Che's camp and says, "You're not going to Cuba. You're fighting for the Bolivian Revolution." And he said, "What Bolivian Revolution?"
Felix identified him as one of his key targets because it was easy to figure out his motivation. And I think a lot of times intelligence officers are looking for the people who have a reason to talk. And I think Paco's reason to talk was pretty simple. He was an unhappy guerrilla.
Rodriguez now develops a plan. If he can find Paco, he can potentially turn him and gain information that would lead them to Che. Special intelligence agent Felix Rodriguez secretly enters Bolivia. His cover, a businessman named Felix Ramos. The hunt for Che Guevara is finally beginning. But the clock is ticking. From March through to July 1967, Che and his guerrillas strike the Bolivian soldiers at will with devastating effect.
They were overmatched by these Cubans who had really honed their craft not only on the Cuban Revolution, but also later in the Congo and some other places.
Then Rodriguez hears news that Bolivian soldiers are searching land thought to be inhabited by Che's guerrillas.
At first, when the Bolivians made a sweep of the property, they found some of the material they left behind, including pots on the oven that still had food in them. But one of the people there tells them, "Look, if you go back there are these hidden caves."
2 weeks after Rodriguez arrives in Bolivia, government soldiers make a spectacular discovery. Che's storage caves. They contain a treasure trove of information on the rebel force.
Felix was able to convince the Bolivians that it was a good thing to take evidence, not to burn it.
Back in his local CIA station in the Bolivian city of Santa Cruz, Rodriguez is presented with the guerrillas' documentation of their contacts in the country, deciphered radio messages from Cuba, and travel information with false names and photographs of the rebels.
One of the things that Felix understood about counterinsurgency is that revolutionaries like to keep journals and make notes. And what he was able to do was exploit these papers, because the exploitation of intelligence, when you pick it up from a guerrilla camp or a cave or off the body of a dead guerrilla, it can prove hugely valuable.
One of the documents taken from the guerrillas' cave is Che's passport. It reveals how he entered Bolivia disguised as a middle-aged Uruguayan economist in November 1966. Rodriguez spends hours combing through every wallet, photograph, notebook and scrap of paper recovered from the abandoned guerrilla cave.
Che was a prolific writer, so he loved to write, and he was very disciplined. He kept all of his details of the operation and all the contacts and all the notebooks in caves.
Every day, Che carefully records the events of his guerrilla campaign in his personal diary. His captured writings provide Rodriguez with a valuable insight on how and where Che's guerrillas operate, who his colleagues and collaborators are, and what Che is thinking. From a military point of view, we had 3 new battles with losses for the army but none for us. The morale of the guerrilla movement is growing stronger, and if handled well, will certainly guarantee success.
Che chose Bolivia because it was a central part of South America. And what his hope was to start the revolution there and then be able to spread it out into the rest of South America.
They believed that if you have a small group of men who are really dedicated and they start the revolution in a rural area, they can recruit the peasants, and that would spread throughout the countryside and eventually make its way to the cities. And then they would take over.
Che's writings reveal plans to create a major uprising using the Bolivian peasants. But as he reads on, Rodriguez discovers Che's strategy isn't working. The locals are not joining them. The peasant base has not yet been developed, although through planned terror we can neutralize some of them. Not one enlistment has been obtained. Rodriguez realizes that Che has wildly miscalculated. He has focused his operation in the wrong part of the country. Che should have chosen the area around Bolivia's capital city, La Paz.
There are really 2 Bolivias. There's the Bolivia that's really active around La Paz, and you have tin and copper mines, and you have unions that are there, and you have the university system and students. That would have been ripe for revolution. But Che, for some reason, he picked this area of Bolivia that was remote, that was scrubland. He picked an area where the peasants, the poor farmers, spoke a different language. They really didn't speak Spanish. And so when he came into the area, they were very suspicious of outsiders. People were just looking to eke out a living. They were just looking to survive. They had no idea what revolution was.
This is critical news for Rodriguez. He now realizes there is weakness. Che's rebel force is not as large as originally suspected. Then Rodriguez's detective work uncovers another clue to Che's operational plans. The guerrillas' account books. They show that all the funds for Che's revolution passed through one person's hands in Bolivia's capital city, La Paz. The problem is, they have a photograph, but no name. Rodriguez realizes if he can track her down, he can cut Che off from all his funds and communication. But who is she? Then, a critical piece of intelligence comes through to Rodriguez's CIA station in Santa Cruz. In a remote area of the country, a local farmer reports that he's spoken to some guerrillas. They had turned up and asked him where they could safely wade across a swollen river to get some supplies.
The guerrillas had no support from the people because they attempted to contract with a farmer who was going to give them a safe way to cross the river. So they were using the locals to help, while the locals sold them out to the Bolivians.
The Bolivian army now set a trap. They tell the farmer to put a white curtain on a tree to let the guerrillas know where it is safe to cross. During the early hours of the morning, Bolivian soldiers stake out the area. From his base in Santa Cruz, Rodriguez urgently calls the Bolivian commander and tells him that it's vitally important that any prisoners taken are kept alive so he can interrogate them.
Felix understood that you don't get intelligence by killing people. You get intelligence by making them your friends and eliciting information from them, and he was very good at that.
The Bolivian soldiers wait all day for Che's guerrillas to show up. Then, as evening approaches, the guerrillas, guided by the farmer, begin to wade across the river at the agreed spot. As they reach midstream, the Bolivian soldiers open fire. Seven of Che's guerrillas are killed.
At the end of the battle, they were able to pull 2 survivors, 2 men who were wounded.
One is executed. The other is identified as Paco, the man Rodriguez believes could be the key to getting to Che. Rodriguez receives the news of Paco's capture. His worry is that the Bolivian soldiers will shoot him before he can interrogate him.
That's why I interceded and told him this prisoner was very important to us. If you believe that the information we got from him is not worthwhile, I will never ask you for another prisoner. But please give this guy to us. And he did.
Felix went to get him and flew him out and made this youngster realize that he was not going to be killed. And the relief must have been overwhelming because the other guerrillas were dead.
He was wounded in 2 places. Not lethal, but he was wounded in here and in this place here, in these 2 places here. So I did pay for a nurse from a hospital to come over and to treat him. And we were able to save his life.
Back in his base in Santa Cruz, Rodriguez can now begin the most important part of his mission. He can interrogate the person who he thinks could lead him to Che. At first, Rodriguez plays the nice guy.
He gives them clothes, he lets them, buys them magazines, he allows them to write letters home. And on the flip side, he starts building rapport with them just by talking to them.
Little by little, Rodriguez gets Paco to open up.
I could tell that the guy had a tremendous memory. He would cite the location where he was months before, and he could give you the address and the name of 15 people. And that's very unusual.
After 2 weeks of interrogation, Rodriguez realizes the great revolutionary Che is in even more trouble than he thought.
From Paco, he was able to find out that this was a very fractured unit. There was a lot of infighting. There was no harmony. This was a dysfunctional revolutionary band.
They didn't have enough food. They weren't able to scrounge from the people because the people weren't supporting them. What it did is it degraded his force to the point where they were really combat ineffective.
A lot of the Bolivians wanted to desert and go back to their families. The Cubans were hardcore, and they said, no, you're not going to desert. And the Cubans basically took over.
Thanks to Paco's information, Rodriguez now realizes that Che's guerrillas are on the point of collapse.
And he realized there weren't hundreds of soldiers out there. There was this small unit, they were a ragtag unit, and really, it wasn't whether we're going to beat them, it's we need to get Che.
Rodriguez then decides to show Paco the photograph of the mysterious person who controls Che's funding and communication network.
So I brought these pictures to Paco, and Paco was the one who identified Loyola Guzman and told us, this is La Coyola Guzman, who is from the university.
Loyola Guzman, 25, a graduate of the elite Communist Party activists' training school in Moscow, a member of the Bolivian Communist Youth. She is Che's key contact and financial organizer, working out of a secret cell in Bolivia's capital city, La Paz. This is a huge breakthrough for Rodriguez. He calls in the Bolivian soldiers to arrest her, but she refuses to talk, saying she would rather kill herself than betray her comrades. Despite her silence, CIA agent Rodriguez has won a victory. By capturing Guzman, he has cut Che off from his funds and communication. Rodriguez has them exactly where he wants them. The rebel force is now completely isolated and on their own. All the CIA need to do is initiate an operation to finally bring Che to his knees. But Rodriguez still doesn't know where Che is. Then there's another breakthrough. Bolivian soldiers fire on a small band of guerrillas. 3 are killed.
The 3 men are brought in on the back of mules.
If Rodriguez can identify any of the dead men from his long study of this rebel force, he might have a clue to Che's whereabouts. Rodriguez finds a driving license and documents. The names, he knows, are bound to be false, but they do contain photographs. Back at his CIA office in Santa Cruz, Rodriguez compares these documents to the information he's collected in his files. He is able to identify the 3 guerrillas. One, called Miguel, is captain of Che's front column.
One thing that Felix was a good detective. He was a good investigator. So at this point in the campaign, he knew every member of Che's group. He knew how they moved.
Che divided his column into 3 sections, with groups of men traveling in the front, middle, and rear guard.
Che split his force into 3 that would march in certain intervals so that you would never caught all of them together.
Rodriguez knows that Che always moves in the protected middle column, just 1,000 meters behind his front men. Using the location of where Miguel is killed, Rodriguez is able to determine Che's position. This is the breakthrough he's been waiting for. It is the critical moment. He now knows where Che is. He's got to strike immediately. Rodriguez urgently calls the US Green Berets Command to release the Bolivian 2nd Rangers Battalion from training and send them in to combat Che.
I said, we are convinced that Che Guevara is in the area.
At first, there was pushback. They said, they're still training. They haven't even had their graduation ceremonies yet. How are we going to send them out there?
Felix argues that this is the last bit of training. This is the parade and the hand-holding of the medals, and it's not as important as what they know already.
I said, we have to move the battalion right now. We want to get him.
Rodriguez eventually gets his way. The Bolivian battalion are dispatched immediately to hunt Che down. Rodriguez receives information from the Bolivian command that there is a band of 17 guerrillas holed up in a ravine, somewhere deep in the Bolivian countryside.
The area that they were working in was a very rough, mountainous area. It was not like dense jungle the insurgent could hide very well in.
the Bolivian army starts to move in.
Che was really trapped in this valley, and by now the Ranger Battalion was in the area hunting him down, using the techniques, the training they received from the Green Berets.
Che and his guerrillas discover they are now completely encircled by the Bolivian troops.
It is the key moment in the campaign. Tactically, it's perfect. It's exactly what they were trained to do, which is they set up a blocking position on the high ground, and then they sweep through the canyon, trying to flush Che out.
The continued pursuit, and that's what they did. They ran these guys into the ground, literally.
As the guerrillas try to escape, the soldiers, all recent graduates of the US Army Special Forces training camp, pick them off. Che's rebel force is now locked in a heated battle, and the tide is turning in the favor of the Bolivian army. One guerrilla is putting up a fierce fight. A bullet strikes him in the leg and he collapses on the rocks. As the soldiers ask him to identify himself, he shouts, "Don't shoot me. I am Che Guevara, and worth more to you alive than dead." The wounded Che is brought back to a small hamlet. He is kept under guard in a schoolhouse until the Bolivians decide what to do with him. The news reaches CIA agent Felix Rodriguez in his station in Santa Cruz.
When Che was captured and we heard the news, you know, it was a tremendous feeling.
Rodriguez now flies in to where Che is being held. The first thing he does is photograph all of Che's captured documents.
And that's important because when Che surrenders, he has this knapsack, and it has his diaries, because Che is a prolific writer, and every day he would sit down and write another diary entry telling all about the campaign. And Felix Rodriguez recognizes immediately just how important this is. He's going to start taking pictures of the diary for the CIA so they can process it.
These pages document in detail Che's 11-month military operation in Bolivia and his revolutionary thoughts. It will help to inform the CIA on how communist-backed guerrillas plan and cement their armed revolutions. But then Rodriguez learns something alarming. The Bolivian officers holding Che are threatening to execute him. This is directly against Rodriguez's orders to keep him alive so the CIA can interrogate him.
Felix's mission there, though, is really to try to save Che's life, because the CIA at that point had told him before he left, we want this guy alive. If you can get Che alive, get him alive.
Rodriguez now appeals to the Bolivian military's top brass to halt the execution. The answer comes in a coded call, sealing Che's fate.
We had a very simple code: 500 Che Guevara, 600 dead, 700 alive.
Rodriguez is given the code 500 for Che, 600 for dead. Che is to be executed.
Felix was conflicted because on one hand, he had his orders from the CIA to keep Che alive. And now he was receiving orders straight from the Bolivians saying Che was going to be executed. And so at first he thought, well, how can I get, how can we plan his escape? How can I get him out of here and smuggle him back?
I reflected on it, and I thought could have tried to save his life. At the same time, I felt there was a responsibility I wasn't about to take. I believe that letting history run itself was the best thing that could have happened. So at that point in time, I thought there's not much I can do anymore.
Rodriguez enters the schoolhouse to give Che the news. These two men have been playing a lethal game of cat and mouse. And now, the final confrontation.
Che would talk to no one. He would not be talked to, but he talked to Felix. And the question has always been why. And to me, the answer is that Felix treated him like a man.
I looked at him and said, "Commander, I'm sorry. I tried my best." He perfectly understood what I was saying. He turned white like a piece of paper. But he said, "It's better this way, as you have never been captured alive." And then he changed the expression and said, "And if you can, tell my wife to remarry and try to be happy." That was the last word.
What is interesting about his face-to-face confrontation with Che Guevara is exactly how against type it was. This is a man who he considered scum of the earth, who he considered a murderer, a sociopath, and yet he treated him with great compassion. He treated him as an equal.
We looked at each other, he approached me, we shook hands, and we embraced.
Rodriguez asks if he can take a picture of the two of them side by side. Che agrees.
I gave my camera to the pilot, and I stood next to him, and some soldiers next to us put my hand around him and said, "Commander, look at the little bird." And he laughed. It's a Cuban saying, "Mira el pajarito," when you tell that to kids, look at the little bird. Actually, when I gave the film to the CIA, I told them there's a picture of Che with me laughing. Of course, when he saw the picture was going to be taken, he changed the expression.
This is the last picture taken of Che alive. Now the moment has come to carry out the orders from the Bolivian High Command. Rodriguez briefs Che's executioner, a Bolivian soldier who has volunteered to shoot Guevara. Executing Che without a trial is illegal, so Rodriguez orders the soldier to make it look like he has died in battle.
Don't shoot from here up, shoot from here down, because this man's supposed to die from combat wound.
39-year-old Che Guevara then says his last words. "I know you've come to kill me. Shoot, coward. You are only going to kill a man." So ends the life of one of the most famous revolutionaries of all time. The man who set out to overthrow US-backed governments and destroy America lies dead.
Che Guevara was a charismatic, provocateur, revolutionary, gangster, murderer who's hugely unsuccessful in Bolivia. And I think he met the fate he deserved.
Che's body is flown to a local town where he is laid out for public display. It's a message to everyone. Revolutionary terrorism will not triumph. Back in Washington, the CIA views this as the perfect operation. They've been stalking Che for over 10 years and have now finally ended his reign of terror.
For the Americans, I think it was some relief. He had been a ghost for so long, they had tracked him for so long, and they knew that he was such the heart of this exporting of the Cuban-style revolution. To be able to have him gone and not be able to start a revolution down there was I think, greeted well.
High on the list of CIA successes is the way Rodriguez broke new ground in Bolivia with his pioneering investigative techniques.
I think that his insistence on keeping Paco alive, I think the way he exploited intelligence, I think the way he elicited information, the way he dealt with the Bolivians on a one-to-one basis made it possible for them to do the capture that they did. Felix's mission in Bolivia was to help track down Che Guevara. The way he went about it was revolutionary. And I think it set the course for counterinsurgency in the ensuing decades.
It was a blueprint for everything that's done right and continues to be done right to this day. A lot of the techniques are still being used, especially in Afghanistan.
6 weeks after Che's capture, Rodriguez was back in South America training an elite Ecuadorian intelligence unit in the anti-terrorism techniques he had perfected in Bolivia. Argentina, El Salvador, and Lebanon followed. In 1969, the man who caught Che Guevara became an American citizen and enlisted in the United States Army. During the Vietnam War, he flew over 300 helicopter missions and was shot down 5 times. He received 9 crosses for gallantry by the South Vietnamese government. And during his career with the CIA, Rodriguez was awarded the Intelligence Star for actions of extraordinary heroism. But despite all this, Rodriguez will always be remembered for his CIA mission to hunt down Che.
You know, I was 26 years at the time, 26-year-old. I have done a lot of other things that I consider probably more important, but for one reason or another, this is the one who have become more famous because of the figure of Che Guevara.
March 2011. Libyan rebels rise against Muammar Gaddafi. What at first appears to be a spontaneous uprising is in reality the culmination of a carefully managed, top-secret, 30-year-old CIA operation.
The goal here is to get rid of Gaddafi, to overthrow him.
For decades, America has been plotting to remove the man it branded the mad dog of the Middle East.
Gaddafi was a chief sponsor of terrorism.
They wanted him out. They wanted to make an example of him.
Because there's evil in this world, and the evil's got to be dealt with.
What few people know as the rebellion against Gaddafi unfolds is that the man leading the uprising is in fact a long-time CIA contact.
Khalifa Haftar and his lieutenants were trained by the CIA to remove Gaddafi.
There's a bunch of Libyans, you give them arms, say, all right, go, get rid of Gaddafi.
His relationship with the CIA dates back to the 1980s.
He returned to Libya 20 years later to finish a job that was left undone.
Recent investigations reveal that the Libyan rebels are directed and coordinated by CIA experts on the ground. This is the top-secret account of the true extent to which the CIA was instrumental in the Libyan revolution, which took down Gaddafi. CIA headquarters, Langley, Virginia. The North Africa desk is buzzing. They are monitoring secret communications coming in from Libya.
Satellites and electronic surveillance would be collecting huge amounts of communications between any sort of threat to the United States.
The first 387 messages are innocuous. But when they reach the 388th, everything changes. It appears to be a direct threat.
I got intercepts that were clear-cut. It wasn't a question. No one could argue with them.
The intercepted message reads, "Stand by and be ready to attack American targets and execute the plan." The CIA immediately considers it to be an imminent and credible danger. The message emanates from the intelligence headquarters of one of America's most dangerous enemies, Muammar Gaddafi. Since leading a coup to overthrow King Idris in 1969, Muammar Gaddafi has been the tyrannical dictator of Libya.
He'd taken over in 1969 as a very young colonel, and he'd managed to institute a system, if you like, of divide and rule. He made sure that the army high command never grew too strong. He never really had a rival.
Originally, the West had thought they might be able to deal with Gaddafi.
I think there was hope that the U.S. could work with him. And, that rather quickly went away.
Having quelled dissent in Libya, Gaddafi soon embarked on a campaign of murdering Libyan opponents abroad.
He had spies everywhere, both at home and abroad. He very much kept a watch on the exile movement, such as it was.
He wants to get rid of these opponents who have left Libya. And he sends assassination squads to Europe and hires people in the United States to kill members of the opposition.
He had his hit teams out knocking off Libyan, I think he called them stray dogs.
He allows dozens of terrorist groups to run training camps in Libya.
Well, it's often said that he was, the key controller of terrorism or terrorist groups, certainly in the Middle East and maybe to some extent Africa.
Muammar Gaddafi gives money and weapons and passports and safe haven to a number of terrorist groups.
The CIA have long suspected he is actively targeting America.
Gaddafi was seen as the bogeyman because of his sponsorship of terrorism.
They didn't like Gaddafi, they looked at him almost as sort of a, ideological menace.
The CIA know that Gaddafi is behind terrorist acts around the world, including the slaughter of American and Israeli civilians by Palestinian gunmen at Vienna and Rome airports in 1985.
He was a significant enemy to the United States.
For most of my time in CIA, he was a problem one way or the other.
But what makes Gaddafi truly terrifying is his unpredictability.
This mad dog of the Middle East has a goal of a world Muslim fundamentalist revolution.
President Reagan, of course, famously called him that mad dog because Gaddafi's behavior was so irrational at times.
He was sort of a lunatic.
The man at times seemed to be unstable, but on the other hand, he was obviously clever, and he played things very well.
Now it seems that the mad dog is ordering a direct attack on American targets. The question is, who are the targets and where are they? Later that day, Libyan intelligence officers contact their agents abroad. The message is intercepted by a CIA listening post.
The Americans had managed to basically tap into pretty much all Libyan communications with their diplomatic premises abroad. The Libyans were not nearly as careful about covering their traces as, say, the Syrians or the Iraqis. So the Americans knew that something was afoot.
The CIA discover the location for the attack: Germany.
The communication had been with East Berlin, and the People's Bureau in East Berlin had tipped Tripoli off.
The message from the Libyan embassy in Berlin reads, "Tripoli will be happy when you see the headlines tomorrow." The CIA now have a date and a rough location, but little time to try to stop the attack. The CIA station in Berlin is put on full alert. All they know is that someone, somewhere in the city, is preparing an attack on an American target. Agents are ordered to contact all informants to gather any intelligence about the impending attack. But as the hours pass, their investigations yield little actionable intelligence. In the early hours, at the La Belle nightclub, a spot popular with American GIs, revelers are enjoying their night out. Nobody notices a woman entering the club carrying a bag. Then, in Langley, another message is intercepted. Again, it originates from the Libyan embassy in East Berlin, sent at 1:30 a.m.
The Libyans did that just minutes before this bomb attack took place.
The message simply says, "Happening now."
There's been yet another major terrorist incident, this time in Berlin. A bomb ripped through a nightclub frequented by Americans.
230 people are injured in the blast. 3 will die. A young Turkish woman and 2 US soldiers.
The bombing of the disco in Berlin was a fairly seminal event in that Americans died.
For the first time, the CIA have cast iron evidence that Gaddafi is behind an atrocity against their citizens.
This particular bombing, which killed a lot of innocent civilians, was kind of a touchstone for the U.S. government. They now had some evidence that they could use openly.
There was certainly good information that Gaddafi was behind the Palestinians that blew up the La Belle disco.
There was enough intelligence to indicate that that bombing was not an isolated event. It really was a pattern of operations that Libya was engaging in and was absolutely going to continue into the future, and they would get worse.
This is not a case of picking on some guy to make an example of him. The man wasn't innocent at all. Gaddafi was indeed doing what the Reagan administration was saying that he was doing.
There is such a thing as evil. Today, it is not popular to talk about evil. I mean, there aren't any evil people in some people's minds, but anybody who supports terrorism is evil, and the evil's got to be dealt with.
In Washington, a decision is made. They have to punish the Libyan leader.
It was enough for the Reagan administration to go after Gaddafi. That was the fuse that lit the whole thing.
Dealing with Gaddafi was at the top of foreign policy, from the president down to the executive agencies like the CIA.
The big sea change was becoming more aggressive for the first time on terrorism.
The Reagan administration said, all right, we're going to draw a line in the sand.
They saw it as an opportunity to have a regime change there one way or the other.
The United States felt that it needed to send a signal to the state sponsors of international terrorism.
When our citizens are abused or attacked anywhere in the world on the direct orders of a hostile regime, we will respond so long as I'm in this Oval Office.
There is no question now that America will retaliate. The only issue is how. To lead the fight, Reagan turns to his hardline head of the CIA, William Casey.
Reagan was really looking to establish a much more muscular foreign policy. And he had in his team people like William Casey at the CIA.
Well, Casey obviously was a very intelligent guy. He was a risk taker, and that's different from being a gambler.
He was a very intimidating person if you were afraid of him. He was had a very short temper. He didn't suffer fools lightly.
In many respects, he was a wild man. He had really no time for the moderates, you know, the make nice people.
Casey was determined to do something about Gaddafi.
He was very hawkish, and he wanted to restore American prestige around the world.
Casey suggests a top-secret black operation in which Gaddafi will be eliminated. But getting to Gaddafi will be extremely difficult.
He was a maverick, but he was a maverick with a level of desert cunning, if you like, that made him very, very difficult to remove.
Libya is a military state. Gaddafi is protected by thousands of dedicated troops, including a personal retinue of female Amazonian bodyguards. On top of this, the CIA has barely any agents or assets in the country.
I told them we didn't have the capability or the kind of message they wanted.
Casey also has another problem. Political assassinations have been outlawed in the United States since 1974.
During Watergate, Gerald Ford, the president, issued an executive order banning assassinations by any agency, including the CIA.
Early in his presidency, Reagan had reaffirmed this commitment.
Reagan himself had signed the presidential directive that forbade assassination.
So Casey's hands were tied.
They wanted to remove Gaddafi without contravening that directive.
A covert assassination attempt on an individual may be against the law, but overt military action against the Libyan state is regarded as a legitimate and justified response.
The U.S. response was really a military operation.
The president initiates Operation El Dorado Canyon. Instead of sending in a CIA hit squad, the U.S. will launch airstrikes on a series of military targets inside Libya.
The decision was taken to go after, quote, the command center, unquote.
Both the president and Casey know that the command center is actually Gaddafi's home.
It was a substantial bombing raid against Libya and specifically against Gaddafi, targeting his huge compound in Tripoli.
This is an assassination attempt in all but name.
Now, sitting around that table, there wasn't any winking or, eyes rolling or anything like that about what are we really up to here. Everybody knew damn well that there was a good likelihood that we could take out Gaddafi without, quote, targeting him.
To attack the residence or home of the leader is clearly a targeted assassination, just like if somebody were to try to attack the White House.
What's the hell's the difference if you're gonna kill somebody, whether you do it with a single bullet to the head or you do it with a 2,000-pound bomb? I mean, let's not have an argument about it.
For Operation El Dorado Canyon, U.S. planes will launch raids on a series of targets in Libya's main cities, Tripoli and Benghazi. It is up to the CIA to provide the intelligence on the exact locations of the targets for the strikes.
The National Photo Interpretation Center, which belonged to the agency, provided the photography that was used during the planning for which places to attack.
The targets include military compounds, government buildings, and anti-aircraft batteries. But the key target is Gaddafi's command center, a sprawling compound in the heart of Tripoli, which includes Gaddafi's home and a Bedouin tent where he is reported to spend most of his time.
The problem was hitting Gaddafi's command headquarters, which we all knew was connected to his home, if you will, which was in a tent.
The difficulty the CIA face is timing. The bombers need to strike when they can be certain Gaddafi is in his tent. Without agents on the ground, this will be almost impossible to know.
The intelligence available as to Gaddafi's whereabouts wasn't particularly very good.
So Casey turns to Israel.
Israel is a very, very close ally, both politically and in intelligence areas, and so we work with them really as our intelligence and political brothers and sisters, really.
Agents from the Israeli Secret Service, Mossad, set up a surveillance post overlooking Gaddafi's compound. They locate the tent and confirm that Gaddafi is in there. The main contingent of US F-111 bombers take off from American air bases in Britain. As the bombers cross the Mediterranean Sea, fighter planes on US aircraft carriers are scrambled to escort them into Libyan airspace. As the American bombers approach Libya, the Israeli surveillance team confirm that Gaddafi is working late into the night in his tent. Having reported this back, the Mossad agents withdraw. "40 minutes later, the first F-111 jets strike. Casey and other key CIA chiefs are assembled in their offices having a drink as they wait for news.
Casey, I was there, maybe 2 or 3 others, and listened to the information coming in on the particular attack.
Eventually, they've received confirmation that the bombers have hit the Libyan military targets. It seems that the mission is a success, although there is no official confirmation of Gaddafi's fate. Meanwhile, at the White House, the president has assembled his military advisors. An hour into the raid, 2 men arrive at the White House with a videotape in a locked briefcase. They play the tape to the president and the assembled military chiefs. It is the footage from the F-111s conducting the airstrikes. Later that evening, President Reagan takes to the airwaves.
At 7 o'clock this evening, Eastern Time, air and naval forces of the United States launched a series of strikes against the headquarters, terrorist facilities, and military assets that support Muammar Gaddafi's subversive activities.
The following day, a reconnaissance aircraft is sent to survey the damage.
They put up an SR-71 when they had some daylight, and it ran a mission to actually look at what had happened on the ground.
It confirms that the bombers have hit the CIA's most important target, Gaddafi's compound. It has been devastated, and Gaddafi's tent leveled. But there is still no news on the fate of the Libyan dictator himself. The following evening, news channels break the story that Reagan and Casey had dreaded.
Good evening. This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting. Muammar Gaddafi apparently is alive, but questions still far outnumber answers, and mystery still rules 48 hours after U.S. combat jets blasted Muammar Gaddafi's Libya.
Now, in the aftermath of the U.S. attacks, Gaddafi's regime exploits the collateral damage caused by the bombings. Although later proven to be a lie, Libyan news agencies even claim that Gaddafi's adopted daughter is among the 60 dead. The grim truth for the CIA is that the mission has failed.
The results were probably not what anybody expected. They expected better results.
The goal of El Dorado Canyon was to get rid of Gaddafi, and that didn't happen.
Gaddafi was not even injured.
With the door closed on further military operations, CIA Chief Casey must now turn to other means to eliminate Gaddafi.
I don't believe the niceties of how he would be removed from power bothered the Reagan administration. They wanted him out.
Casey now focuses on a classic clandestine CIA method. The agency will foment an uprising of Libyans to overthrow Gaddafi.
In terms of getting rid of foreign leaders who pose a threat, there's always third parties that can be used to do this.
It is a strategy the CIA have employed successfully for decades.
Well, I think having regime change, using covert action as the principal instrument, has been tried a few times, okay?
From Guatemala to Chile, the CIA has covertly supported rebel groups to oust anti-American leaders, providing them with training, weapons, and high-tech support.
When you think about it from an operational perspective, is the best case scenario. The U.S. government doesn't have to get its hands dirty per se, and the third party does it. And if something goes wrong, well, they take the blame for it.
Critical to this sort of action is having the right person to lead the rebels. Casey believes that if he can find the right leader, a Libyan rebellion is the best way to be rid of Gaddafi.
Already there have been efforts about putting together a paramilitary force of Libyans to try and have a little regime change in Libya.
For 7 years, Casey had been secretly supporting Libyan opposition groups in neighboring countries, providing weapons and training. The problem for the CIA is that the Libyan opposition to Gaddafi is divided.
Libya is not a country. It's a bunch of tribes within colonial borders. And what do you do with tribes? I mean, how do you raise the Libyan tribes? I mean, this isn't Lawrence of Arabia.
Casey realizes that he needs someone from Libya who can unite the different factions.
Casey was sorting out who should lead it, which Libyan should lead it or could lead it.
The man Casey is looking for needs to be someone who knows Gaddafi well.
The idea was to get as close to Gaddafi as we possibly could, especially his generals and others would certainly be the target of the CIA.
Eventually, Casey believes he has found the man he wants to lead the Libyan rebellion, Colonel Khalifa Haftar. At first glance, Haftar seems an unlikely choice of leader for an anti-Gaddafi force. He's one of Libya's leading military commanders.
Khalifa Haftar was a professional soldier. His relationship with Gaddafi went right back to the day of the revolution when they overthrew King Idris.
He is a skilled tactician who commands loyalty from his troops. For much of his career, he has been involved in fighting with Libya's southern neighbor, Chad.
He was very much involved in Gaddafi's occupation of a big chunk of Chad, which Gaddafi always had designs on.
Despite leading a fearsome campaign, in 1986, just at the point when Casey was looking for someone to lead the rebellion, the Chadian army regrouped and overwhelmed Haftar's forces.
Several hundred Libyan troops, including Haftar, were captured and imprisoned.
Back in Libya, Gaddafi is furious. His army has been decimated and tens of millions of dollars in equipment lost. He blames Haftar for the failure and leaves his former friend to rot in a Chadian prison cell.
And at that point, Gaddafi washed his hands of the whole operation as if there weren't any Libyan POWs anywhere. And he didn't know anything about the Libyan troops that had been in Chad and had disappeared.
For the CIA, Haftar's imprisonment is a major recruitment opportunity. If they can convince the colonel to turn against Gaddafi, he will be the perfect man to lead the rebel forces. So the CIA activate one of their major assets, the president of Chad himself, Hissène Habré. The CIA have provided substantial support to Habré in his wars against Gaddafi. Now Casey decides to call in the favor. After 7 months languishing in a Chadian prison, Haftar is visited by President Habré.
And it was reported that Habré at one point went to see him.
It is believed that the Chadian president makes Haftar an offer on behalf of the CIA.
Habré offered him the option of turning against Gaddafi, of joining a rebellion, of forming an army in exile, and then marching on Libya.
Having been abandoned by Gaddafi, Haftar agrees to side with the CIA.
Haftar and many like him decided that they would turn against Gaddafi, and they formed the Libyan National Army.
In a classic CIA maneuver, a small force is put together. At its core, the 300 men captured with Haftar. The CIA will arm and train the force with the aim of using them to instigate an uprising in Libya.
The force was certainly trained by CIA people, and the weapons, of course, came from us, and the money and the vehicles and so on and so forth.
The idea was that a force would be formed that would be big enough and strong enough to go back and at least begin to sow the seeds of a rebellion inside Libya.
And the United States begins to train Libyan resistance fighters to go back into Libya and overthrow Gaddafi.
Two years on from the US military attacks on Libya, Gaddafi remains strangely quiet. The US believes that Operation El Dorado Canyon, while failing to kill him, has at the very least deterred him from further terrorist activity. But Gaddafi is secretly planning another devastating act of terrorism, which occurs in late 1988. Pan Am Flight 103 prepares to depart for New York from London Heathrow. Among the baggage is the suitcase of a Libyan agent who never boards the flight.
Clearly, Gaddafi didn't give up.
The most dramatic piece of evidence that Gaddafi didn't learn the lesson of El Dorado Canyon is the fate of Pan Am 103.
Hundreds of passengers board, most of them Americans, heading home for Christmas. As they take off, the passengers are unaware that they are in imminent danger. 38 minutes after takeoff, as the aircraft passes over the Scottish town of Lockerbie, a timed device in the suitcase goes off. All 243 passengers are killed, as are 11 people on the ground. Gaddafi has struck again.
We charge that 2 Libyan officials, acting as operatives of the Libyan intelligence service, along with other co-conspirators, planted and detonated the bomb that destroyed Pan Am Flight 103.
At the time, it is the worst terrorist attack ever inflicted on American civilians. After Lockerbie, the whole world responds. Not with bombs, but sanctions. Gaddafi is frozen out. He becomes an international pariah. The CIA, however, remained determined to go even further.
Gaddafi has managed, through his own actions, to put himself at the top of the hit list for the United States.
In Washington, they are pinning their hopes on a revolution to overthrow the man they call the Mad Dog, led by Khalifa Haftar and his CIA-trained force of rebels. Then events in Africa ruin the CIA's plans. In 1990, the pro-American government of Libya's neighbor Chad is forced out and replaced by a new president who is hostile to the US-backed Libyan rebels.
So suddenly you have these several hundred Libyan soldiers sitting in Chad, getting ready to take action against Gaddafi. But the new president of Chad doesn't want them there.
Worse still, the coup had been supported by Gaddafi, and now the Libyan leader wants his payback. Gaddafi knows all about Haftar's army, and he demands that they be handed over to him. Gaddafi wants Haftar dead. The CIA is forced to come to Haftar's rescue.
The Americans come in with transport planes into N'Djamena and remove them. And then this odyssey starts that goes on for the best part of a year.
America funds the evacuation of Haftar's force from Chad in what becomes known as Operation Magic Carpet. The 300-strong group are transported first to Nigeria, then on to Zaire, and then finally to Kenya. But the CIA-backed rebels discover that they are unwelcome in country after country.
Ultimately, the Americans are left with no choice but to bring them back to the US.
The man the CIA want to lead a Libyan rebellion settles in suburban Virginia, only a short drive from CIA HQ in Langley. His men are settled across the country in 25 different states.
Haftar himself, after this long odyssey across Africa, settles in Falls Church, Virginia. He lived in a very nice house, he had a lot of kids, but he still always harbored this idea of returning to Libya.
For the CIA, it is a huge disappointment. But they retain the hope that at some point Haftar's force will be able to regroup and return to Libya. As the years pass, Gaddafi is contained by relentless sanctions and continued international political pressure. Then in September 2001, the kind of threat that Gaddafi poses to the world is placed in a very different context. On September the 11th, 2001, 19 Islamic terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airliners and crashed them into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. It is the dawn of a new age of terror. A much more frightening force than Gaddafi emerges from the shadows: Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is not state-sponsored. It marks a revolutionary shift in terrorism. So America moves to all-out war.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
With the stakes dramatically raised, Gaddafi switches sides.
Well, Gaddafi's change, or supposed change, didn't surprise me, frankly, because he is a total opportunist.
Gaddafi did a remarkable turnaround. Publicly, he came out against terrorism and acts of terrorism, went out of his way to build a relationship with the US government.
Few believe Gaddafi is really a changed man. He is simply desperate to save his own skin.
Gaddafi is afraid of the George W. Bush administration. The administration is talking about weapons of mass destruction. It's focused on Saddam Hussein, but Gaddafi didn't want to take a chance that he would be enemy number one again.
He realized that his plans against the West were going nowhere, and essentially he could lose his government and even his own life.
The one-time mad dog of the Middle East quickly reinvents himself as a valuable ally in President Bush's war on terror.
He makes a strategic calculation and does a deal with the United States. The effect of that is that he becomes a poster child for unilateral disarmament.
Today in Tripoli, the leader of Libya, Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi, publicly confirmed his commitment to disclose and dismantle all weapons of mass destruction programs in his country.
It is an almost inconceivable change in relations between Gaddafi and the West. Gaddafi, the former international pariah, is visited by a stream of Western leaders. Sanctions are dropped, oil flows out, and money flows in. With the war against al-Qaeda America's primary objective, and by appearing to have transformed himself into an ally, Gaddafi has succeeded in removing himself from the CIA's hit list.
Gaddafi was never worthy of an American embrace as a human being. Gaddafi's record is horrendous. And that's not a record that you could ever expunge. But American interests in the region changed over time.
In 2009, Gaddafi is even invited to speak at the United Nations in New York. It seems his rehabilitation into the international community is complete. However, in a 90-minute rant to the United Nations, Gaddafi calls the Security Council terrorists, says George Bush should be charged with war crimes, and demands $7 trillion in compensation for colonialism. To the CIA, it is clear that Gaddafi remains as unstable and dangerous as he ever was. Two years later, a new opportunity for the CIA to deal with Gaddafi arises: the Arab Spring. Inspired by revolts in Tunisia and Egypt, popular protests break out across Libya.
In February of 2011, as the Arab Spring takes off, it finally percolates through, if you like, to Libya, and a protest in Benghazi gets out of hand and quickly becomes an uprising.
Gaddafi sends his troops against the protesters, believing no one will interfere.
Gaddafi probably in 2011 concluded that he was going to be okay, that the Americans would not move against him.
But he was wrong. As the Libyan protests grow into an armed opposition, the US joins its NATO allies in providing air cover to protect Libyan civilians from Gaddafi's troops.
Today, I authorize the armed forces of the United States to begin a limited military action in Libya. That action has now begun.
NATO's mission in March 2011 was essentially to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe in Benghazi. It was clear that there was going to be an absolute bloodbath as Gaddafi's forces moved east, and the Benghazi uprising was essentially no more than that. It was just a chaotic popular rebellion that could have easily been suppressed by Gaddafi's forces. But NATO's mission then began to creep. It began to involve hitting anything that Gaddafi had that moved, not just his air force, but anything on the ground that moved.
Under the protection of NATO air support, the Libyan rebel forces are growing in strength and now control much of eastern Libya. But for the CIA, the rebels pose a problem. Some of them are potentially a threat to American interests.
At that point, the Transitional National Council, which is trying to get its act together, trying to form a united front against Gaddafi, is all over the place. There are factions, there are rivalries within the military apparatus.
The worry is that Islamic militants like al-Qaeda will hijack the revolution. The CIA want to see a military commander they can trust, Colonel Khalifa Haftar, in charge of the rebels.
The Americans want Haftar to go back to Libya, to join the fight, to professionalize the rebellion.
For Haftar, once a senior leader in the Libyan army, taking on Gaddafi is personal.
Haftar, in any case, would have gone. He had never forgiven Gaddafi for the way he deserted him in Chad some 20 years previously, and he wanted to get his own back. He was determined to be part of that rebellion.
1 month into the rebellion, Haftar arrives in Benghazi with a handful of his officers to cheering crowds. Within weeks, he is installed as the commander of the rebel forces.
The CIA needed trainers to help this ragtag army that was forming. That's what Khalifa Haftar was there to do, to help organize an otherwise completely disorganized rebellion.
With their preferred man in charge, the CIA is better placed to steer the Libyan rebellion. Haftar is in command of troops on the ground. Now America helps lead the fight from the skies. NATO becomes, in effect, the rebel air force.
There were about 17,000 NATO missions over that summer period. And of course, that needed a great deal of coordination from the ground.
CIA agents from its elite Special Activities Division operate covertly in Libya. They identify targets and call in airstrikes to support the rebels in their war against Gaddafi.
There were CIA operatives there to help the rebels communicate with each other, to plan better, to be able to sustain their advances.
Thanks to this CIA support, within a few short months, the rebel forces take control of key Libyan cities. After 6 months of heavy fighting, the Libyan capital falls to the rebels, and Gaddafi goes into hiding.
Gaddafi disappeared, as did his sons. Nobody knew where the Gaddafis had gone.
The CIA now begins hunting for the Libyan dictator. Drawing on every available source, the agency eventually discovers that Gaddafi has retreated to the northern city of Sirte.
Gaddafi had gone to Sirte with an ever-diminishing band of supporters, but gradually the rebels' noose around Sirte from east and west was tightening.
Gaddafi is surrounded. In the early hours, a convoy of vehicles attempts to break out of Sirte.
In the skies above, NATO assets had been patrolling for a long time, and they were able instantly to see this unusual activity.
The CIA scrambles a reconnaissance drone and scan the airwaves for communications, desperate to find out if Gaddafi is in the convoy. Agents then receive vital intelligence. A call from a satellite phone is intercepted from the convoy. The CIA confirms it is Gaddafi.
Gaddafi makes a break for it in a convoy of dozens of vehicles trying to get out of Sirte.
The CIA now alerts United States Air Force drone commanders in Las Vegas, who launch a deadly Predator drone from a base in Sicily to intercept the convoy.
In no time at all, Hellfire missiles are raining down.
The drone's missiles slam into the convoy, while NATO fighter jets bomb from overhead. As rebel forces advance on the ground, Gaddafi is forced to make a break for it on foot.
Gaddafi is discovered, dragged out, beaten, and thrown across the hood of a car.
The rebels turn into a baying mob. They unleash a murderous revenge upon Gaddafi for 4 decades of oppression. His body, beaten and bloodied, is paraded as a trophy.
That was the very demeaning end to a man who had ruled Libya for 40 years, who had regarded himself as a prophet, really, for the Arab people.
For the CIA, Gaddafi's death is a triumph. They had always had him as a target, and although it had taken 30 years, eventually their plan has worked.
Haftar and his lieutenants were trained by the CIA to remove Gaddafi. The fact is that instead of helping to remove Gaddafi in the late 1980s, they came back 20 years later and finished the job.
The CIA has been instrumental in removing Gaddafi in what, until now, the world believed was an entirely Libyan uprising. Guatemala, 1954. The Central Intelligence Agency launches an operation codenamed PB Success to overthrow the government that is threatening American interests in the region. It is the first ever mission of its kind.
Operation PB Success was risky, it was dangerous.
500 rebels will face off against a president's army of 6,000.
There's a lot dependent on this op, and they can't let it go wrong.
The CIA has hand-picked the next leader of Guatemala, and he is the head of the rebel force. The soldiers will be trained by Rip Robertson, a legendary paramilitary agent.
Come on, come on!
And their weapon of choice? Psychological warfare, used by the CIA for the very first time.
Black psychological warfare revolves around deception, lies.
Based on recently declassified files, we reveal the CIA's first ever attempt to overthrow a left-wing government in Latin America. Washington, D.C. A top-secret meeting is convened at the White House. Its task: to deal with a brand-new security threat. A small country in Central America, Guatemala. Present are America's most powerful men. The President, Dwight Eisenhower, his Secretary of State, and Allen Dulles, head of the Central Intelligence Agency.
Eisenhower ran the government in a very clandestine way, and the three of them concocted a lot of strategies around the world.
Now they have a new problem. A country less than 800 miles from America's southern border, Guatemala, has recently elected a leader with known communist links, Jacobo Arbenz Guzman. Already, Arbenz has begun to threaten American interests. His government confiscates thousands of acres of land from the multinational company United Fruits.
This added up to being a national security threat to the United States of America.
With the Cold War well underway, the concern in Washington is preventing the spread of communism throughout the world, and in particular, the Western Hemisphere.
The CIA started to see communists under every rock.
And they were willing to commit forces to tear them out of power.
The decision is made. Arbenz must be removed.
The CIA had been itching for an operation to overthrow the Guatemalan government.
The president is shown a highly classified document, which contains an extraordinary plan. It's called Operation PB Success.
They gave him the outlines of how you can overthrow an established regime without committing any American forces at all.
The plan is to secretly back an armed uprising against Guatemala's freely elected leader, Arbenz, and topple him in a coup d'etat. But Eisenhower is nervous. The CIA plot must not be traced back to the American president.
Why was the U.S. so afraid of being involved? One, because it would be seen as overthrowing a democratically elected government. It would be violating the tenets of the treaty it had signed at the United Nations. It would have been a gigantic black eye for American ideals.
It had to be covert. It couldn't be traceable to the president.
The operation combines three key strategies. First, to invade with a small, specially trained force. Next, to apply external political pressure. And finally, to use a whole host of covert agency tricks.
PB's success had a new strategy, things that had not been seen before, modes of action that had never been practiced before.
The methods are so novel that the CIA don't even know if it's going to work.
It was dangerous because nobody knew exactly what would happen.
They give the operation only a 40% chance of success.
The CIA had to turn this on a dime into an actionable, workable covert operation.
Eisenhower said, I'm all for it, let's go with it. I think it's going to work, and I think it's important to do.
The CIA's first move is to establish a command center at Opa-locka Air Base in Miami, Florida. The command center is so top secret that only a few men working directly under the president himself know where it is.
Why Miami? Because first of all, it was outside of Washington, D.C. If they'd placed it in Washington, D.C., the whole operation would have been exposed.
With the command center in place, the CIA now need a figurehead who can lead a rebel force against the Guatemalan president.
The leader had to be somebody who was malleable, who would obey CIA edicts, and would be loyal to the U.S. government.
The CIA place its bets on a man called Carlos Castillo Armas. Armas is a charismatic and ambitious Guatemalan colonel. 3 years earlier, he was involved in a failed military coup. He'd been locked up by the Guatemalans and, according to rumor, had made a brave escape. The CIA find him living in exile in Honduras.
The CIA had decided he was the perfect candidate to lead the charge and reestablish, through him, U.S. control of Guatemala.
Armas is flown to the command center at Opa-locka, and a deal is struck. The next challenge is to build a guerrilla rebel force who will lead the uprising. The CIA set up a top-secret training base in the jungles of Central America. The man assigned to train the secret army is Rip Robertson, an ex-paramilitary black ops specialist.
He loved being out there in the jungle. Some people thrive on it. You can't take a real warrior out of the war, and that's how Robertson was.
Rip Robertson loved this kind of stuff. This was what he was born to do. And for him to be paid to operate under the auspices of the U.S. government must have been nirvana for him.
Come on! Come on!
In January 1954, training begins. Robertson is told to turn these men into a trained fighting force in just 6 months. The troops are Guatemalan exiles, recruited from neighboring countries in Central America. Among them, professional mercenaries. Keeping the rebel force to no more than 400 men allows them to train in total secrecy.
Rip Robertson, he had to train his team in guerrilla tactics. Like they say in special operations, you can come in, cause your damage, and get out undetected.
Robertson trains them in sabotage, demolition, and weaponry, and puts them through a grueling routine that will get them across Guatemala's tough terrain. But this is the easy part. Armas and his handful of mercenaries must now face a formidable opponent, the Guatemalan army.
Guatemala had the largest army and the largest police force in Central America. They had 6,000 in their army and 3,000 in the police force. No other country in Central America could match that.
At the moment, the army is loyal to its recently elected leader, Arbenz, who enjoys the support of the Guatemalan people. Arbenz is also a skilled general.
Arbenz himself was a respected military man, considered brilliant and cultured by the CIA itself.
Pitted against a popular and powerful opponent and his loyal army, the CIA face what now seems overwhelming odds.
So here's the question. How do you take a rebel force of about 200 or maybe 400 men and put it up against an army of 5,000 to 6,000 men?
The CIA think they have the answer. A secret weapon developed covertly within the agency that has never before been tried out this close to American soil. Until now.
Psychological warfare, or PSYOPs, revolves around deception, lies, doing things, dirty tricks that you couldn't get away with if you revealed your identity.
PSYOPs has been around since the Second World War, but until now had never been tried on this scale.
This was the first time the CIA had ever tried this kind of maneuver to overthrow a government.
The CIA recruits radio and public relations expert David Atlee Phillips to run the psychological warfare part of the operation. They call it Operation Sherwood. This is aimed directly at undermining the president's popularity by turning hearts and minds.
So what do? They create a clandestine radio station. They call it Radio Liberación, or Voice of Liberation. The idea of the radio station would be to present it as the secret voice of the Army of Liberation that was about to come and free the people of Guatemala.
The first phase of Operation Sherwood will take place at Opa-locka. To help him, Phillips flies in 2 Guatemalan radio announcers, who declassified files refer to as Mario and Pepe. As part of the psychological offensive, they must put together hundreds of hours of radio recordings, which will later be broadcast in Guatemala itself.
So one of the first questions facing the CIA operatives is, who do we target?
Phillips has a choice. Do they target the ordinary Guatemalans, the intellectual elite, or even religious leaders?
Yes, we target all those people, but our main target is the army.
Targeting the army and the generals is critical. Phillips knows that it's the generals and senior officers who are their single biggest obstacle.
So all of this feeds into the central goal of the Black PSYOPs, which is to drive a wedge between Arbenz and the military.
Phillips devises a series of radio shows designed to split the army away from its leader.
One of them was called We Accuse of High Treason, and it specifically charged that Arbenz had abandoned the army, had betrayed the army, were traitors, and needed to be dealt with swiftly and urgently.
The aim of the treason shows is to plant the idea that officers siding with the government would receive severe treatment after the coup d'etat.
Here are more names to include on the blacklist of traitors to the country.
Next, Phillips targets the officers where they are most vulnerable, their pockets.
One of their campaigns suggested that the currency was about to collapse and that Arbenz would no longer have the money to pay the officers. Nothing inspires more fear in the ranks of hired guns than the lack of a paycheck.
Guatemala are nevoie de democrație. Toată lumea trebuie să iasă.
Day after day, night after night, for 6 entire weeks, Phillips and his team make hundreds of recordings. Once the recordings are ready, the CIA transport the tapes from Opa-locka in Florida to a secret radio station close to the border of Guatemala.
To this day, we still don't know where Operation Sherwood was broadcasting from. Some reports have it in the jungle in Honduras. Others have it in a barn on the farm belonging to the dictator of Nicaragua.
Less than 3 months after Phillips is recruited, Radio Liberación goes live.
Radio Liberación, transmitiendo desde
Radio Liberación, broadcasting from a secret place within the Republic, will be on air twice a day.
The propaganda radio shows made in Opaloca are now heard all across Guatemala by tens of thousands of local listeners, unaware that this is a CIA plot. Meanwhile, with Rip Robertson's trained rebel force ready to strike, the CIA now execute the final piece of the master plan: to isolate President Arbenz politically. Setting up the isolation game begins in late October 1953, when the CIA fly American diplomat John Purifoy to Guatemala.
Ambassador Purifoy was carefully picked for his arrogant personality, for his hard rock anti-communism.
His job is to ramp up pressure on President Arbenz.
Purifoy was very flamboyant. He wore Borsalino-type hats with feathers in them. He always seemed to carry a shoulder holster with a pistol in it.
His first attack on Arbenz comes only a few weeks later, when he's invited to meet the country's president.
You have this extraordinary scene. All Purifoy does is harangue him about communists in his government.
And that really sort of laid down the marker of how Purifoy was going to behave from then on out.
One of Purifoy's first jobs is to set up a secret CIA office inside Guatemala City. But where would an ambassador set up an operations center without being spotted by the government? It is, of course, the US Embassy, where he himself is based.
They took over an entire floor of the embassy to do all the internal planning that had to be done in order to achieve the ultimate objective, which was to get rid of Jacobo Arbenz. You would have seen a secretive area of the embassy totally committed to the operational work to get rid of the Arbenz regime, which would have meant, maps, lines of authority, individuals to be contacted, planning different tactics that were going to be used. The whole schmear, basically, would be devoted to figuring out in a very deliberate way to get rid of this government.
With the CIA base inside the embassy established, Purifoy sets about finding who among the Guatemalan elite could possibly be turned against their own government.
Part of the effort at the US Embassy was to pay money to get Army officers to defect. This was a crucial operation because the CIA planners felt that if the Army could be undermined, then that would be the end of Arbenz. That was the one defense that Arbenz had that was impregnable at that point, and it was difficult to figure out how to get around it. So much of the time was spent on trying to encourage officers to defect through monetary payments. In fact, at one point, the money was offered to Arbenz himself to give up power. And of course, he threw that person out of the office for having even suggested it. So this was an attempt to pull out the underpinnings of the army and make it so weak that it would be virtually worthless as a protective operation for Arbenz.
While Purifoy works the enemy inside Guatemala itself, the CIA turn their attention to the world at large in their search to undermine Arbenz. The CIA needs something big. A political incident so damaging that it will allow America to unleash a political barrage against Arbenz.
They were, in fact, looking for a raison d'etre to give them justification for what they were about to do, and it fell into their laps.
The CIA's lucky break comes not in Guatemala, but 6,000 miles away in communist Eastern Europe. In April 1954, a CIA spy based in Poland spots suspect cargo being loaded onto a ship called the Helm.
They were able to figure out that this ship had unusual characteristics, that it was probably carrying weapons.
The spy reports the Helm to the CIA, alerting it to the fact it could be heading towards the Americas. The CIA tracks the progress of the Helm as it heads towards the Caribbean.
They traced the voyage of the Helm through its shipping lane to Dakar in Africa and then on to the Dutch West Indies.
But after 3 weeks, it suddenly makes a sharp turn and heads south.
Ending up, totally to their surprise but pleasure, Puerto Boreas in Guatemala.
Four weeks later, the Helm docks. When it does, the CIA see all the evidence they need, crate after crate of it. In total, 2,000 tons of small arms, including rifles, machine guns, and mortars.
That gave them proof that the communists were truly infiltrating this country, and it gave them justification for invading it.
Eisenhower now has all the diplomatic ammunition he needs to unleash a political firestorm against Arbenz. In response to the arms shipment, he sends warships, planes, and submarines to patrol the coastline of Guatemala.
Everything in the arsenal was configured to bring down the Guatemalan government. Eisenhower was fully behind it.
Arbenz can now only watch in horror as his country is strangled by a naval blockade. Arbenz and his generals begin to wonder if America itself will even invade.
Arbenz understood that there was a significant campaign mounted against him by that point.
Alarmed at Washington's show of force, Arbenz tries to build political bridges with America.
He sent out his foreign minister, Torriello, to meet with Purifoy, the American ambassador, to see if they could work out a truce.
The last thing the CIA want now is a truce. Operation PB Success has only one mission: regime change. In mid-June, the 500-strong rebel army is transported to forward attack bases close to the Guatemalan border. They're deployed to 5 strike points along Guatemala's eastern front. By splitting into 5, the CIA aim to create the illusion of a much bigger army than it really is.
They created the dramatic sense that this was an all-encompassing assault from the Pacific side to the Atlantic side, from the neighboring countries, that would destroy every defense Guatemala had and allow Castillo-Ramos to take over the country.
In support of the ground invasion, the CIA also deploy a dozen unmarked aircraft to the front line.
They were flown down by serving U.S. Air Force officers who to date have not been identified.
From the point of view of military psychology, the aircraft were a tremendously important asset.
The planes will not only back up the troops, but play a key part of the psychological operation by enhancing the illusion of a huge invasion. With the Air Force on standby and the army poised and ready for action, the CIA contact the leader of the Guatemalan rebels, Castillo Armas, and green-light the invasion.
There's a lot dependent on this op, and they can't let it go wrong.
The coup d'etat now begins. In late evening, coup leader Castillo Armas is on a remote road close to the Guatemalan border. He leads 120 of the total force of 500 soldiers. They are the eastern prong of the invasion. If all goes to plan, in just a few days' time, he will be Guatemala's next president.
As they approached the border, they saw that there was 2 guards.
One of the guards is a customs official. He's quickly overpowered.
The first shot is fired in this coup attempt. Right there, chaos.
The second guard lies dead as the convoy crosses the border into Guatemala. The plan is to continue the advance on foot. The CIA favors a guerrilla approach to hide the true size of the force.
The longer they can have the army to believe that there are thousands of people in there, the greater advantage they had.
Armas's men head through the tough terrain for 3 entire days.
The jungle's thick, it's hard to navigate. You also have torrential downpours.
On day 3 of the invasion, they reach the small town of Escapillas. After a short battle with local policemen, Castillo Armas wins his first victory.
People of Escopillas would have been a bit shocked by these guerrillas showing up in their main square. Some of the troops did was they handed guns out to various puzzled residents of this village to give them the sense that these people were joining forces with Castillo Armas to finally oust Arbenz.
Meanwhile, 100 miles north of Armas, the second prong of the invasion crossed the border. They run into an army garrison at Gualan. The battle is the fiercest in the invasion so far. It rages for 36 hours. It's the first big test for Rip Robertson's CIA-trained mercenaries.
You're going to take their lives, or they're going to try to take your life. And it's life or death at that point.
But then, it starts to go wrong. One by one, the rebels begin to flee. When the remaining soldiers realize what is happening, none of them wants to be captured and charged as traitors.
People are going to see these people fleeing, 2, 3, 5, 6 people fleeing. They're going to start thinking that might be the best thing to do. And that's one of the problems you have with a ragtag army.
In the end, almost the entire second column flees back to the border. This is the first major setback for the rebels. Many of their troops are wounded or killed. In Washington, the situation is about to get worse. The plan was to ramp up pressure on the Guatemalan president in the diplomatic arena. But world leaders are now suspicious of America's stance.
The Arbenz government decided to go to several international bodies to seek protection. The first was the United Nations. The second was the Organization of American States, the OAS.
In Caracas, the 10th Inter-American Conference hears Foreign Minister Torriello of Guatemala, whose country is the target of a United States resolution against communism in the hemisphere. While accepting the resolution...
The United Nations even agreed to assemble an investigation team to analyze the invasion. This risks exposure of the CIA plot. Facing international humiliation and a failed coup d'etat costing millions of dollars, time is running out for Operation PB success. Back in Guatemala, the rest of the invasion is going from bad to worse. The third prong of the invasion, in El Salvador, doesn't even make it into Guatemala. 60 rebels are arrested as they try to cross the border. The fourth prong, attacking Puerto Barrios in the north, is defeated by armed dock workers.
The reality of the situation was beginning to look bleak.
There is still more bad news for the CIA. Even the air attacks fail to hit targets. Almost all the strike aircraft are paralyzed by mechanical failure.
That basically reduced their air assault by 50 or 60%.
As a result of that, the invasion force was basically stymied in terms of their air support. And they were concerned that they were not going to be able to follow through without the show of force.
With the all-important Air Force grounded and Almas's uprising only 6 miles into Guatemala, the whole CIA operation now hangs in the balance.
Only the top CIA managers knew how close this whole thing came to failure.
A few days into the assault, the CIA receives a top-secret intelligence estimate, now declassified, that says we don't know where this thing is going to go. If the Army sides with Arbenz, our whole campaign is lost. But if it turns against Arbenz, this could be a victory.
As the operation reaches crisis point, Alan Dulles, head of the CIA, holds a top-secret emergency meeting with President Eisenhower. The president is shocked when he hears about the military failures.
Eisenhower was puzzled because he thought everything had been going correctly according to the plans of the CIA.
Dulles tells it to him straight. The only chance of reversing the catastrophic invasion is if the president himself provides a small contingent of America's best fighter planes.
So he asked Dulles point blank, "Can you really win this if I give you 2 more planes?" And Dulles said, "Well, I think there's a 20% chance we can win this." And Eisenhower at that point paused and said, "All right, I'll give you the planes."
Declassified files now reveal that the president provides Dulles with 2 brand new F-47 bombers at a cost of $150,000.
Well, the F-47N Thunderbolts were certainly the most powerful aircraft in Central America at that time.
Concerned that someone would discover US involvement, the CIA have the American badges removed from the planes as they're smuggled to Central America.
They have a sense that, you know, this thing might not actually work out, but we've got to try anyway.
Whether the F-47s will be enough to turn the tide of the invasion is a gamble. But the CIA still have one last trump card yet to play: psychological warfare.
Operation PB's success was all based on illusions. It was based on the idea that you could create in the mind of the Guatemalan people that this huge force of rebels was about to take over the country.
So the CIA upped the tempo on the Radio Liberación transmissions and began round-the-clock news bulletins that talk of a devastating invasion.
If you tuned into the radio, you would hear one story after another of a rebel victory. You would hear railroad tracks being bombed. You would hear fuel depots being sabotaged. The reality was entirely different. Armas's army was hundreds of miles away, barely 6 miles into the country.
Next, the CIA targets the Guatemalan military.
A major victory for the CIA in Operation Sherwood came when a colonel, the former head of the Guatemalan Air Force, defects, flies his own private aircraft across the border, and turns himself into the CIA.
David Atlee Phillips, in charge of the radio campaign, wants the colonel to announce his defection live on air. But he refuses.
Phillips says, okay, have a scotch. Have another scotch. Next thing you know, the guy's sort of in a semi-drunken stupor.
With the colonel becoming increasingly drunk, Phillips secretly records his words on a reel-to-reel machine as he recounts his defection.
As soon as Phillips could, he spliced the tape and put it on air.
Not only are other Air Force officers listening to the radio broadcast, but so is President Arbenz. The president immediately grounds the Guatemalan Air Force, afraid that its officers might defect too.
It was a major triumph for Operation Sherwood.
But the tricks do not stop here. They get more and more deceptive.
One of the clever tricks the radio station did to try to enhance its credibility was it faked an attack on the radio station. So if you were tuned in, you would hear their typical broadcast, and all of a sudden you would hear shouts and screams. You actually heard children in the background shuffling around. And then the radio went dead. No sound.
But it is all a hoax, to fool the listeners into thinking the underground radio station has resurfaced.
The next day, the radio comes back on the air, triumphant. We're back.
The next act of deception comes when the two brand new F-47s arrive in Guatemala. 6 days into the invasion, the air assault begins.
They'd never seen anything like an F-47N Thunderbolt making a low, very aggressive attack over their city.
When we first heard the planes, my mom got very scared, and she hid us all under the bed. It was a difficult time because we'd never lived through a war before.
The aerial campaign is so shocking that the local Guatemalans invent a memorable nickname for the falling bombs: sulfatos.
Sulfato, of course, is a Spanish term meaning laxative, something that would make you go to the facility. That's the gross effect that it had upon the Guatemalan populace.
After the bombing, strafing.
Strafing from the air is probably one of the most terrifying things that a person on the ground can endure. You have an aircraft that's making an enormous amount of noise. You don't seem to be able to get away from it. It's coming directly at you, it seems, with guns blazing out of the wings.
We were very afraid. It was painful. It was utterly horrific.
So imagine the scene in Guatemala. a country that had not experienced terrifying bombing raids, right? And all of a sudden, a low-flying aircraft, engines blazing, dropping an explosive. A loud, colossal sound erupts over the vicinity.
For all the terror, declassified CIA files reveal something surprising.
I don't think they'd wanted to do a lot of damage.
Had the F-47s really wanted to unleash a devastating aerial attack, they would have used the 500-pound bombs for which they were designed. But they didn't.
If they'd gone in there with 500-pounders, F-47N can carry at least 3 500-pounders. They could have done a lot of damage.
In fact, the damage was more show than it was real. Records suggest that not a single death occurred, or even one heavy-duty bomb is dropped during the campaign.
In some cases, actually, they dropped Coke bottles from the aircraft because the popping of the glass sounded like a loud explosion.
This is all part of the psychological operation. The aim of the aerial campaign is not to kill, but to create chaos and panic among the Guatemalan population.
One time they drop a big bomb that isn't actually an explosive device, but it releases a huge black cloud over the city, creating the sense that something horrific had happened.
The smoke bomb leads many local Guatemalans to believe that they are under direct attack.
That was when we saw it. That black smoke was coming out from some place in the capital.
The CIA's psychological tactics go even further.
Another piece of Black Ops tradecraft was to replicate the sounds of a bombing run. So they actually outfitted the embassy in Guatemala City with huge loudspeakers that played the sounds of a bombing run, of jet craft going overhead, to inspire fear among the population.
What the people were saying was that lots were going to be killed and that it was better for them not to get involved in the defense of their government.
En la defensa del gobierno.
Although the psychological offensive is beginning to work, the rebel army is down to a last desperate handful of troops only 6 miles into the country itself. And Arbenz is still in power. The CIA is about to make an incredible gamble to bluff its way from defeat to stunning victory.
Right at this critical stage, Phillips introduced what he called his most important big lie.
The important big lie is the final stage of the fake radio broadcasts, presenting an entirely made-up version of the invasion.
So in some ways, there were 2 invasions. There was the real invasion that showed a paltry invasion force, its numbers reduced by half. And then there was the map created by Radio Liberación. It suggested the force was having unimpeded progress.
The CIA radio broadcasts tell of one victory after another, an invasion which in reality doesn't exist at all.
Rebel forces were moving. They were moving towards the capital. The invasion was successful. The uprising was coming. It was one tale after another of the inevitable victory of the rebel forces.
The biggest lie of all is when the radio reports that thousands and thousands of fictitious soldiers are closing in on Guatemala City itself.
And the lie was that 2 military columns were advancing on the capital, ready to take it over.
The big lie gamble now pays off.
Thousands fled the city. Car traffic stopped. The city itself was slowly becoming paralyzed.
Y la gente se fue a la periferia de la ciudad.
People ran to the outskirts of the city. They were fleeing to safety.
The critical moment of the big lie is when the senior officers turn against the Guatemalan president.
The big payoff for black psyops comes when several Army colonels make clear to Arbenz that they're not going to stand with him. They basically tell him, you and your communist friends have got us in trouble with the Americans, and now you've got to step down.
One by one, the officers around Arbenz distance themselves from the isolated president.
So you're a colonel in the Guatemalan army. You're hearing news of military action, and you're starting to ask yourself, where am I going to be? Where am I going to stand when the dust settles?
Politically isolated, the pressure on Arbenz surges to dizzying heights. Not only does he fear defeat at the hands of his bitter enemy, Armas, but also the terrifying prospect that America is behind him.
It's not the issue of us fighting Castillo Armas and his guys. It's that the United States is threatening to invade and we'd have to fight them.
He was sitting in his presidential office, bewildered and unsure what to do. He had collapsed internally. The CIA had brilliantly undermined him. And that was really the end of his reign.
With the officers turning against him, on June the 27th, Arbenz resigns.
He just couldn't handle it. The psychological pressures were too enormous.
Ten days later, Castillo Armas is sworn in as Guatemala's new president. The exiled colonel, who just over a week earlier was a relatively unknown figure, is now the most powerful man in the country. In Washington, Operation PB Success goes down as a huge victory.
By all accounts, this is an operation that should not have succeeded. This was made possible by gutsy determination and, in some ways, crazy abandon.
Operation PB Success was a brilliant deception, one of the great artistic achievements of illusion that the CIA ever produced.
Operation PB Success proved that psychological warfare could be used as a deadly and effective weapon. It fooled an entire country and ultimately brought down a president. Within the CIA, PB Success becomes the model for future regime change across the world.